very pleased and proud to introduce Dr. Lonny Harrison.
Thank you, Mark, for those very kind words. Thank you indeed. And I'm so pleased to see everybody here. This is really exciting for me. I'm so honored to have been invited to this event and present for the Central Library for their Banned Books Week. My talk is When Books Go Underground. And I'm just going to get started right away because there's a lot of territory I want to cover. I'll be talking about a country, of course, with a long history of censorship and banning books. And that, of course, is Russia, and through most of the 20th century, the Soviet Union. And I'll be speaking, although there are a lot of different kinds of censorship, I'll be speaking mainly about political and ideological censorship, with some other nuances and crossover. So, in Russia, really, some of the great works of Russian literature, and actually those who are among some of the best loved and the greatest works of world literature, have been censored, have been suppressed, banned, often at great peril to the authors' careers and even their lives in some cases. Well, why is that? Of course, we have to bear in mind that the rights and freedoms of the individual really are a relatively modern phenomenon if we think about it. Because for centuries, absolute monarchies in Europe and in Russia considered it their duty, their obligation to censor books, to protect their citizens, to guard their moral betterment. And so, in the past, most governments believed it their duty, and really the rise in the status of the individual and individual rights brought about our view that censorship is objectionable. And it's only in the past couple of centuries since the practice of censorship became something that a person could protest with relative impunity. But in Russia, as in other absolute monarchs of Europe, through the 17th and 18th centuries, it was often the church, first of all, that was the primary censor. And in Russia, it was the Russian Holy Synod, which is the administrative branch of the Russian Orthodox Church. And of course, when it came to Russia, the monarch also was no exception when it came to suppression of sedition, guarding and protecting the authority of the autocracy. And this is Tsar Peter the Great, who reigned from the end of the 17th to the beginning of the 18th century, known as a very formidable Tsar, who was also known for ruthlessly suppressing any kind of opposition to his authority and to the insubordination to the state. But really, I want to start with another Tsar in Russia, actually the Empress Catherine, who was probably the most formidable monarch of the era in Russia and in Europe as a whole. She's also known as the Great, Catherine the Great. You've probably heard a lot about her. She really is distinguished in many ways, not least of all the fact that she was a very highly educated and learned woman herself, and a polyglot, and a writer and author. She corresponded with Voltaire, the French philosophe, and other philosophers and writers and thinkers of the age. And she reigned under the banner of so-called enlightened absolutism, which, as you undoubtedly know, was the spirit of the age for monarchs who believed that through education, enlightenment, they could, with absolute authority as an autocrat, rule in the wisest and best possible way for their subjects. And she, in truth, was a very forward-thinking and enlightened ruler. She convened a legislative commission to reform the law code and change the older Muscovite laws to more of a modern law code for Russia. And her instructions to the commission proclaimed the equality of men before the law and disapproved of the death penalty and torture and a lot of the things that actually were the concern of constitutions in Europe and even later in the United States here. So, although the ideas of Catherine were forward-thinking and could be called enlightened, at the same time she was unwilling to tolerate any insubordination in her empire, and actually a couple of events really affected her outlook and changed the tenor of her reign towards the end of it. In particular, a peasant uprising known as the Pugachev Rebellion, and better known, the French Revolution, which of course frightened all the monarchs across Europe with good reason. And so Catherine later was unwilling to tolerate much the kind of free thinking that she actually initiated herself at the beginning of her reign. But this was the time when satire was really coming to the fore. And there were a couple of writers who, in particular, would challenge the authority of the Tsarina via satire in their writings in their satirical journals. But Catherine, being a good sport, wanted to play along, and she actually started her own satirical journal in which she could wage polemics with the other authors, but she also made sure to set the rules of the game, which is that you could only write so-called smiling satire, which is what she called it, which meant that you could only criticize character flaws and foibles and things like that, nothing too serious. And you could only talk about certain social types. You couldn't name any names. Basically, you couldn't say anything that could really undermine or criticize her reign or the empire. Well, of course, any artist who is given a set of limitations wants to break them. So there were a couple of individuals, these two men, Nikolai Novikov and Alexander Radishev, who would challenge her authority and feel the wrath of Catherine. The first, Novikov, he is known as the first journalist, as such, in Russia, and he was also one of the greatest publishers himself. And in fact, at the time of his life and career, over half the books published in Russia were published by his press. So a large figure. He was actually a part of the legislative commission that Catherine initiated, and encouraged by that kind of free-thinking, liberal type opportunity, he opened a number of satirical journals, and it wasn't long before he took the liberty to challenge the Tsarina herself, and prompted Catherine also to lash back. And with in the intervening years, finally with the French Revolution, etc., and Catherine being a little less willing to tolerate any criticism of her reign and her empire, eventually decided that she had enough from Novikov, closed his printing press, closed his journals, and exiled the author himself, put him in prison for 15 some odd years. He did survive that incarceration, but afterwards was embittered and weakened by the experience and didn't publish any further. A similar fate awaited Alexander Radishev, who's most famous for his book called Journey from St. Petersburg to Moscow. And this was a real bombshell of a book which was a travel log of sorts during his journey from the two capitals, and observations about the state of the empire, especially the abuses of serfdom, the abuses of landowners, beating and sometimes murdering their peasants. And it was a real eye-opener, and of course angered Catherine greatly, who was unwilling to admit that there were such kinds of horrible social problems in her country. The book was banned, and Radishchev was sent into Siberian exile, which he also survived, but later ended his own life with suicide. And this, the fate of these two individuals, unfortunately, is indicative of what would come through the ensuing centuries in Russia and the Soviet Union. And also this example of Catherine and Nabokov and Radishchev really shows how closely tied the ruler was to the writers and publishers. Catherine probably is the most extreme example, except maybe until Stalin in the Soviet Union, but we will see other examples that I want to present now, especially of Tsar Nicholas I. And generally speaking, the literary activity generally in Russia was a dangerous business, and was usually subject to censorship, repression, and, as I've been saying, in some cases peril to the lives of the authors. So jumping ahead a little bit to the 19th century, the century began with a revolt of some high-ranking officers. You've probably heard of this rebellion called the Decembrist Rebellion. The Decembrists are not only an indie rock band for some of the younger generation. They were officers who actually had been many of those who were on the Napoleonic campaigns. As you know, Napoleon got as far as Moscow, but couldn't supply the army to make it through the harsh Russian winter, and retreated, and the Russian army chased Napoleon back to France. But in the meantime, in France, were exposed to and learned and brought home a lot of liberal ideas from the West, having to do with constitutional monarchy and republicanism, basically democratic forms of representative government. That did not sit very well with the Russian Tsar, of course. These gentlemen knew that, and they spent years meeting in secret societies and plotting an opportunity. And that came when there was a changing of the guards, so to speak, when a new Tsar was being crowned. And at his coronation, instead of pledging allegiance, they demanded that the Tsar accept some limitations to his authority, such as a constitutional monarch, or at least some kind of charter of rights and freedoms. Well, Nicholas, he was the Tsar ascending to the throne, was no fool. He had wind of the revolt before it took place, and actually was quite easily able to suppress it. Executed the main conspirators, and exiled the rest to Siberia. So after that point, Nicholas, being a very uncompromising man and a formidable Tsar himself, decided that such a danger as the Decembrists should never be allowed again in a properly run autocracy. Therefore, his reign was characterized by very repressive measures. He was a very strict conservative ruler, and his reign is best defined by this policy of official nationality that he devised, which these are the three pillars: orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality, under which he defined the Russian state. And also, more pertinent to our topic, he devised a state security force, which was called the Third Department, or the third section, the Third Department of His Majesty's Chancellery. And this really was a kind of political police that was the forerunner to something like the NKVD or the KGB later in the Communist Soviet Union. And it was kind of an unwieldy, large bureaucratic type body, and it expended a lot of resources for very few results. However, it was the autocrat's weapon against subversion and revolution. It was the arm of censorship and supervision of literature, and it meddled in personal affairs, business affairs, every kind of affair, and really it was the Tsar's police that would set a precedent for the rest of the century, and as I was saying, into the 20th century with the Soviets. But the Tsar himself, like Catherine, also did take a personal interest in some of the great writers who, especially those who posed some kind of threat, and that included this gentleman, Alexander Pushkin, who is Russia's great national poet, on the stature of a Shakespeare or a Byron or a Goethe. And he was a famous poet from a very young age. He was seen as a prodigy. He wrote epigrams and verses, which also, however, really were very cavalier in tone, and he was not afraid of poking fun at the authorities, be it his teachers and educators or the Tsar himself. And actually, I have one anonymous verse that's attributed to Pushkin, however, when he was just a young man, to Emperor Nicholas I. He was made emperor, and right then displayed his flair and drive, sent to Siberia 120 men and strung up 5. So this just gives a little bit of the character of Pushkin, and so his early fame was tarnished by his reckless personal life and this cavalier attitude toward the authorities. He actually earned himself exile on more than one occasion. Actually, he was exiled by the Tsar that came before Nicholas, Tsar Alexander I. But he also had many friends among the Decembrists, and in fact was a confidant and most certainly would have been part of the Decembrist rebellion had he not been under house arrest at the time already. Nicholas, of course, being the wise ruler that he was, decided that he would bring Pushkin back to St. Petersburg, give him a full pardon, even knowing Pushkin's ties to the Decembrists, but in a clever policy move, decided that he would be the personal overseer and censor of the poet. And so this was the beginning of a strange relationship, to say the least. And Pushkin was subjected to even more meddling supervision. He made several attempts to go abroad, which were denied by the Tsar. Many of the things he attempted to publish were denied. And matters were complicated by the fact that Tsar Nicholas was interested in Pushkin's wife, and this was the occasion for much grief and humiliation for the poet, not least of all because the Tsar gave him the service rank of Kammerjunker, or gentleman of the chamber, which meant that Pushkin needed to be present at all the royal balls with his wife in attendance. So the Tsar could pay courtesies to her. And we could go on and talk about intrigue and scandals in Pushkin's life for the rest of this hour or longer. But really, my point being here that Pushkin's Pushkin being under the thumb of the Tsar and being forced to curtail his expression and his work as a poet really ensured, first of all, made Pushkin understand that enlightenment and talent counted much less than obedience to the state, and also ensured that Pushkin's text became a place not only for cultural and aesthetic discourse, but also for social and political controversies, which they are rife with. And it's one of the reasons we're still so fascinated with Pushkin today. He really gives us a window into Russia of the 19th century and the national history of the country, and really the poet's place in society and the individual's place vis-a-vis the state are very much a prominent concern in all of Pushkin's works. And his work remains and continues to be provocative and vital. Another provocative publisher during Nicholas's reign was a gentleman named Chadayev, and he, in the 1830s, is known for a series of letters called philosophical letters, which were scathing criticisms of his nation's historical development. And they sparked a debate which would continue for the rest of the century between groups known as the Westernizers and Slavophiles. The Westernizers were those who advocated Western-style reforms in Russia, and Slavophiles who harkened back to the days before Peter the Great's Western reforms and believed that Russia had its own unique culture and destiny. Chadayev was a Westernizer. However, he was critical of the development since Peter, saying that Russia had contributed nothing to world culture because it was so dependent on other cultures, and in fact said things like this on the slide: "We are an exception among people. We belong to those who are not an integral part of humanity, but exist only to teach the world some type of great lesson." A bit of an enigmatic statement, but one that's unambiguously unfavorable to Russia, and did not sit well with the authorities or with the intelligentsia or anybody, basically, who read it. And it earned him a trip to the insane asylum because he was deemed clinically insane. And this was actually one way of removing somebody who was seen as a threat to society from society, and it actually set a precedent for a practice which would continue, and especially later in communist Russia, right up until the collapse of the Soviet Union, this was still taking place, where a political dissident would be deemed mentally ill and put into an institution so that they would be taken out of society. Well, this is another example of dissident thought being suppressed, and the ways of dealing with such individuals. Another is Fyodor Dostoevsky, a very well-known writer, and today one of the best loved and most frequently read here in the West. And a lot of people know the story of his life, or part of his life where he was exiled to Siberia, did hard labor, side by side with hardened criminals, murderers, and thieves, etc. But himself being a political prisoner. A lot of people know that he was in Siberia, but do you know the reason he was sent into exile? It was actually for reading a letter in a meeting of a secret society. He belonged to a group called the Petrushevsky Circle. It was a group that was thought to be plotting revolutionary activity. There are really no grounds for that, but he was actually reading a letter from another outspoken critic named Alexander Herzen, who was already in exile in Paris. He was in self-exile. He got to go to Paris. And Dostoevsky was reading a letter from him to the writer Gogol, who had had a change of heart himself, who had embraced a more conservative ideology, supporting the Tsar and the church and the institution of serfdom, etc. So Dostoevsky was reading this admonishing letter from Herzen to Gogol, and the third section of His Majesty's own chancellery had wind of this. They arrested Dostoevsky and some other of the alleged conspirators, and actually sentenced them to execution. Dostoevsky himself faced a firing squad and was within minutes of being shot, or so he thought, until a messenger from the Tsar arrived with a pardon. and his sentence was commuted to 10 years in exile, including 5 years hard labor in Siberia. It really was, in the end, probably a plot, a scheme, a plan to scare them greatly, and it definitely did. Dostoevsky wrote very eloquently about this experience of being within minutes of your life in a couple of places, but most notably in the novel The Idiot, which is listed here, 1869, referring to somebody with epilepsy, the falling sickness, as they called it. He spent those years in exile and actually returned to become the great writer that he was, and wrote all of the works listed here after that. But it really did change his outlook and his ideology, which turned from a revolutionary conspirator to someone of a more conservative outlook, and in some cases you could say even a defender of the Tsar and of autocracy. So a very interesting case study there in Dostoevsky. Of course, there's a lot more we could say about any of these writers, but in the interest of time, and further through the 19th century, the revolutionary movement continued to develop in spite of the efforts of the Tsar to crush any kinds of underground political activity. There's an interesting anecdote associated also with the writer of the book What's to Be Done, by the name of Chernyshevsky. And that's because he wrote this book, which is seen as, in ways, a kind of revolutionary handbook or a manual. It's a novel, but it's seen as a way of predicting what the kind of new generation, the new cohort of revolutionaries would be, and how they would bring about the revolutionary change that they deemed Russia needed. He wrote this book in prison, while he was in prison already, and had it smuggled out to his publisher. The publisher went ahead and lost it in a carriage on the way home. And however, this is where the comedy of errors kind of begins, because somebody turned it in to the police. The police obviously didn't look at it very closely or read it very well, because they basically put up a bulletin saying, "Did anybody lose a manuscript?" So the publisher, of course, came back to retrieve it and published it, and it turned out to be one of the most subversive works of 19th century Russian literature. So the censor wasn't always working over time in Russia, sometimes sleeping on the job.
Probably the police would read half of them anyway.
Yeah, maybe. And actually there was also a tradition of writing things in a kind of veiled language, right? Aesopian language. So you couldn't really see that it was subversive unless you were clever enough to catch the nuances. Fast forwarding a little bit towards the end of the century, Tsar Alexander II, he's the one who followed Nicholas I, was assassinated by a group of revolutionary terrorists. This church was built on the site where a bomb was thrown at his carriage, and he was killed. Then, as you know, the last Romanov Tsar was Nicholas II. He was the Tsar when the Bolshevik insurrection happened, which was the de facto Russian Revolution, which toppled the monarch for good. Nicholas' family was murdered, as you know, a couple of years later. And we begin a new era of the Soviet Union. This man, Vladimir Lenin, was the leader of the Bolshevik Party, which was the party that led the October Revolution. There were a couple of revolutions in 1917, right? There was one in February, then the successful one in October, and then several years of civil war followed that for them to consolidate their power. And while they were doing so, really the challenge for the Bolshevik Party, because they weren't a clear winner from the beginning. They did have to fight a long, bloody civil war, right? And there were loyalists to the Tsar still, who were called the White Army, facing the Red Army. But what the critical issue that faced the Bolsheviks was, as one historian put it, not only the seizure of power, but the seizure of meaning. right? They had to justify their seizure of power and their hold on power. And so they had to change the whole culture. They had to change the political culture and the cultural culture. They had to create new ways of comprehending the world because there was a profound uncertainty, as you can guess, about the meaning of the revolution, right? The meaning of the past, the present, and the future. So they had to create this kind of trajectory using, of course, Marxist philosophy, which we have to call Marxism-Leninism when we talk about the Soviet Union, because they were interpreting a German writer in the 19th century for a Russian context in the 20th century, right? So under Marxism-Leninism, the Soviets set out to create a new culture, create a new way of looking at the world, and really the revolution was undertaken in the name of the proletariat, the working class, right? In a class struggle against the bourgeoisie, who are, you know, the upper middle class, who were perceived as the exploiters, right? Those who exploited the working class, and the reason that they weren't able to have their own self-government, self-determination, etc. And as another historian put it, the Soviets did not believe in the harmlessness of popular culture, right? So together with censorship, which was a major tool at their disposal, another was propaganda. And I want to pause for a moment on this phenomenon, because propaganda for the Soviets didn't have the negative connotations that it has for us today, right? What is propaganda? Well, here's a brief definition. But for the Soviets, really, it was considered a form of education, a way of enlightening the masses, okay? And to allow media, to allow means of mass communication, access to their opponents, to so-called enemies of the state, as they call them, would have been criminally stupid. It would have really been counterproductive. It would have been, you know, pointless. And in fact, it was justified in the name of the revolution, in the name of creating the workers' state. Okay? So, so propaganda was practiced quite openly, as was censorship. And here's maybe a combination of the two. Here's a photograph of soldiers demonstrating during the February Revolution. This was the first revolution in 1917, okay? And with a little bit of early Photoshop technology, they retouched the photo. So instead of just brandishing their spears and swords, now they're carrying banners and signs that say, "Down with the monarch," and other things like that. Okay, so they're just kind of like helping the political culture along a little bit, right? By instilling values as they should be, right? History as it was meant to take place, not exactly how it did. And there are other examples of that. I'm going to skip many years and a lot of events in censorship and repression and come to an era known as Stalinism. Obviously, when Stalin came to the fore as the head secretary of the Communist Party, as you know, he brutally repressed all his opponents to consolidate his hold on power. And this era is probably one of the darkest in Russian history. These were dark years of repression. It was a time of a mass drive for industrialization and modernization of Russia, but at the same time, mass paranoia, denunciations, arrests, show trials, purges. There was a purge of the Communist Party itself, so actually those people who were the highest ranking in the party were some of the most vulnerable during those years in the late 1930s. Of course, it was also World War II. Much of the high command of the Russian army was purged before the start of the war. So the Russian army was decimated before they even joined World War II in 1942. And it's probably one of the reasons Russia suffered such heavy casualties, which they did. They suffered the most of any other country participating in the war. And censorship and repression were relaxed a little bit during the war because as long as the war effort was promoted. But afterwards, it came back in full force, and people actually who were expecting that because of their great sacrifice during the war, things would be a little easier afterwards, were gravely mistaken. The repression was even deeper and darker after the war years. Here's another example of a little bit of creative history, where you have Stalin posing with a few Politburo members, and when people had been purged from the party, of course, they needed to be purged from history as well. So when you see this retouched photograph, the individual on the left has been removed. And so that was done fairly frequently by the Soviets. Again, turning to another topic, socialist realism is very pertinent here because this was a state-sanctioned, you could say, requirement that all art, all artists, all artistic production needed to conform to certain rules determined by the state, and no individual forms of expression or organizations or groups of artists were permitted. And let me just read you the definition of socialist realism as it was hammered out and stamped at a 1934 Congress of the Soviet Socialist Writers. It goes, the demands of the artist, socialist realism demands of the artist the truthful, historically concrete representation of reality in its revolutionary development. Reality in its revolutionary development. Got that? Moreover, the truthfulness and historical concreteness of the representation of reality must be linked with the task of ideological transformation and education of workers in the spirit of socialism. Okay? So, reality in its revolutionary development, okay, education of workers in the spirit of socialism. So again, it doesn't have much to do with realism. It has to do with reality as it ought to be, right? In terms of the political ideology, okay? In terms of the development of history up to that point, so you'll even get a lot of historical works that are looking back, but they're showing how eventually, through the centuries, this would lead to the workers' state, right? Really, this marked the end of all experimentation in Soviet art. The party banned all independent artistic expression, and socialist realism becomes state policy. Artists who strayed from the official line were severely punished. Many were sent to Siberia, once again, and this is a common theme. One such writer who faced these kinds of strictures, but chose to write for the desk drawer, as it were, was Mikhail Bulgakov. And he wrote one of the novels that's become one of the perennially loved works of Russian literature in Russia today and here. And I know whenever I introduce him in one of my classes, his book, The Master and Margarita, is one of the favorite. I actually got a slide for that. Let me pull that up. It's a really creative artist representation of two of the characters. Again, this book was written in the 1930s in Stalin's Russia, but it wasn't published at the time. Bulgakov knew that it wouldn't be published, probably, in his lifetime. It was published posthumously by his wife, and not in Russia itself until the 1980s. But now everybody in Russia has read it and loves it. It's about, it's a satire. It's a satire of the Soviet Union in the 30s, about the devil who comes to Moscow. And the devil comes to Moscow, which is a place, the Soviet Union is a place that is staunchly atheistic. So the people who don't believe in God don't believe in the devil either. So he's very easily able to wreak havoc in Moscow, which he does. And it's also a book that's about a writer. It's a novel about a writer writing a novel, and he's the master. And he actually is also persecuted by the Soviet authorities in the novel, although he has a little bit of help from the devil. But he is sent to an insane asylum like Chadaev was and like others were at the time. All in all, it's considered to be one of the best novels of the 20th century, a satire against the Soviet bureaucracy, and it's still one of the best loved novels, as I'm saying, and it acknowledges the power of the printed word, which is summed up in a way in this quotable, which I've got on the slide here: "Manuscripts don't burn," which is something that that's said by the master in the novel when he tries to burn his own book. Let me move ahead to another writer who is one of the great poets of the era, but is known for writing one of the greatest novels of the time. His name is Boris Pasternak. If you're wondering why I've got parsnips on the slide, can any of the Russian students tell me what it is? Yeah?
His also his name is
Right, the word Pasternak means parsnip. So this is Mr. Parsnip. He wrote Dr. Zhivago. Okay, a book you may know, or you may better know the movie. There have been a couple of movies made out of Dr. Zhivago. Good ones, I would say. But I really love this novel, and it's probably my favorite among the books I've been talking about. And let me just say briefly that Pasternak was a poet who, like many other artists, welcomed the revolution, okay, when it came in 1917, and he wanted to be a part of the epoch. He didn't want to be an outcast, but then became disillusioned with the purges and the show trials of the late 1930s, and therefore had to kind of go into self-exile, stopped writing. He knew that his works would be unpublishable. He went into literary exile, you might say, by turning to translation. And he translated Shakespeare and Goethe and others, and produced some of the best translations of Shakespeare into Russian, actually, that are still read today. And he had been outspoken about Stalin's terror, but he wasn't touched for some reason, because for some reason Stalin took a liking to him. It's still kind of an unexplainable mystery, but Stalin apparently was known to call him on the phone and ask his opinion of other writers. Imagine that. And Pasternak was honest in his assessment of them, but for some reason Stalin apparently said to his police, don't touch this cloud dweller, or this holy fool, or something like that, depending on your translation. Who knows? But amid this climate of heavy censorship and persecution, Pasternak did write his epic novel, Dr. Zhivago, but it couldn't be published in the Soviet Union. It's an epic history of the revolution and civil war and etc. Although it's not the hero, Zhivago himself, is a poet and doesn't really take place in the political events. He's a reluctant participant in the historical events taking place all around him in his life. But that's probably why it wasn't, because it didn't follow the regulations, the requirements of socialist realism, because it ignored the revolutionary struggle, the class struggle of the march of history. Okay, it was a very deeply personal kind of memoir, partly biographical. But it was smuggled abroad and published in Italy in 1957. It was a major success. It was immediately translated into several other languages. And Pasternak was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1958. Well, being a citizen of the Soviet Union, he was not permitted to accept the award. And sadly was forced to refuse the award and was threatened with expulsion from the Soviet Union for having smuggled his book and become famous around the world, essentially. In the interest of time, let me speed ahead again, and I'll just mention very briefly that publishing abroad was one means of avoiding censorship arrest, and another was samizdat, which is a Russian word that means self-publication, or self-publishing. It was a measure resorted to by a lot of writers right up until the 1990s when the Soviet Union collapsed. And they were usually these kind of self-produced sketchbooks, or also they were typewritten manuscripts on very thin rice paper, stacked in multiple copies with carbon copy paper between them, so that they could be printed rapidly and distributed, and they were passed hand to hand. People would get a hold of one of these books and have to read it very quickly and pass it on, because if you were caught with one, there could be very dire consequences for you. So this took place through the Soviet Union up right through the 80s. Finally, this author, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, is one of the best known writers to publish in samizdat, because his manuscript for the Gulag Archipelago was published in this format and circulated in samizdat. It's about the Russian prison system, and it's called an archipelago because it's kind of like a series of islands, right? And Gulag is an acronym that means state security, prison system, in short. And Solzhenitsyn was actually arrested himself and spent years in these prison camps, and this was the first book that really opened them up, that showed the world and showed even people in Russia and the Soviet Union itself that this intricate system of prisons actually existed, because before that it was really not even known the extent of these labor camps. Solzhenitsyn himself, before I get to Russia today, also won a Nobel Prize for Literature, but he was expelled from the Soviet Union and lived out the rest of his life in Vermont, continued to write, and only returned to Russia in 1994 after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and he just recently died in 2008. Finally, turning to Russia today, censorship is alive and well, I'm sad to report. This is the rulership, as you know, of today's Russia, sometimes referred to as the Ten Democracy, because of the co-rulers of Medvedev and Putin. But really it's about Putin. They've traded places a couple times, right? But now that Putin is back in the president's chair, he can do what he does best, which is hunt Siberian tigers and fly fighter jets and things like that. So in addition to censorship, propaganda is alive and well in Russia today. Unfortunately, it's less of a laughing matter, the fact that journalism in particular is targeted in Russia, and a lot of journalists have been suppressed, have been killed. There's a long list. You can look it up on Wikipedia or elsewhere of journalists, and it's shocking. It's every year there's a list of 20 or 30 or more who've disappeared, and it's thought to be because of their reporting. Here's an example. Anna Politkovskaya was reporting on the Chechen War, which is a conflict Russia was embroiled in for decades, and she was actually writing a book called Putin's Russia at the time in 2006 when she was murdered, and she had received several death threats before that as well. So it's quite certain. It's thought to be certain that she was murdered by somebody from state police. There's a documentary about her called 211 Anna. And finally, a story that's been in the news from Russia a lot quite recently, which is this group known as Pussy Riot, and they're an avant-garde activist group who is known for public acts of heresy, such as the recent for which they were arrested was they entered an Orthodox cathedral in Moscow and made a punk rock prayer to the Holy Virgin. And this, of course, was anathema to the church as well as the state authorities. And they have been arrested for this, and it's been a very public case, and there's been a lot of outcry within Russia and from here, from the United States and around the world, people calling for their release. And I'll just finish on this point because it goes to show that Because their point in part was that the church itself is an arm or an agent of a repressive state. They were making public this collusion, which is also one of the points that I began with, the Orthodox Church being one of the first censors in Russia and being closely tied to the seat of power and the autocratic ruler. So I think that's a good place to finish. I welcome any questions if there's time, if anybody can stay, and thank you for your attention.